Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Saha Viryan Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. In our prior class, we introduced this topic of the three shariras, sharira traya. Sharira meaning body. The stula sharira, physical body, sukshma sharira, subtle body, non-physical body, and karana sharira, causal body, which we'll talk about later in this class. This topic may seem a little tangential at first because the name of our text is Ātma-bodha, and technically Atma self. Technically, these three bodies are anatma. They're not self. So if these three bodies are anatma, why are we spending this effort in understanding them? Remember the metaphor I gave in a prior class? A medical doctor has to study anatomy because the physical body is the locus of illness. Unless the doctor understands the locus of illness, the doctor can't treat the illness. Here, we're dealing with a different kind of illness called bhava roga, the illness of worldly life, the illness of suffering. And the locus of bhava roga, the locus is the three bodies, Stula, Sukshma, and Karana Sharira, is the locus of bhava roga, the disease of worldly suffering. So therefore, it's essential that we have to understand the locus of the problem in order to solve it. Let's get ready for our verses. Before we do, one question with regard to last week's class. We discussed how the sukshma sharira, in fact, this verse says, the sukshma sharira includes the five vital forces, five pranas, includes mind and intellect, includes the 10 faculties, the 5 sense organs, and the 5 organs of action. So 5 sense organs, sight, hearing, taste, smell, and touch. With that in mind, the question is, if a person is blind in this life, in their next life, will they also be blind? Keeping in mind that the faculty of sight is associated with the sukshma sharira, and indeed the sukshma sharira detaches itself from this body and travels to another body. But blindness doesn't have anything to do with the sukshma sharira. It has to do with your physical body, stula sharira, in particular your eyeballs. If your physical eyes are defective, you're blind. Even though your sukshma sharira has the faculty of sight, but if your physical eyes don't work, then the faculty of sight that's part of the sukshma sharira is unable to function. So blindness is a quality of the physical body. It's not an attribute of the subtle body. So, to introduce today's topic, today we'll be discussing the karana sharira. Let's introduce it properly. In the prior class, in fact, end of the class, you remember I gave a really nice metaphor based on computers. Your computer has hardware and software. In the same way, you have hardware, your stula sharira, and you have software, your sukshma sharira. And you might remember some of the supporting arguments. Your computer has a hard disk. On the hard disk are many gigabytes of data and memory. The hard disk weighs several pounds, but all the data and programs on that hard disk weigh nothing. So this is a distinction between stula, which is physical and has weight, and sukshma, which is non-physical and has no weight. Your computer has stula, hardware, and sukshma, software. And just to finish that analogy, we said that if you have an out-of-date computer, you might transfer all the data and programs from your old computer to your new computer, which is obviously a really nice metaphor for reincarnation, the transmigration of software. In fact, they call it software migration, not transmigration. So your software gets migrated from one computer to another, just as your sukshma sharira gets transmigrated from one physical body to another physical body. And to finish that metaphor, we said there was a third factor. Even though you have a computer hardware and software, it won't function unless there's a third factor, and that third factor is electricity. If your computer isn't plugged into the power and turned on, it won't function. Similarly, this sthula sharira, physical body, and sukshma sharira that enlivens it, cannot function except for being in the presence of Atma, consciousness. When the sthula and sukshma sharira are in the presence of consciousness, and that gives rise to a living conscious being, like you and me. So that electricity for the computer metaphorically represents consciousness or Atma for us, a third factor. Notice that third factor is not the third sharira, which is now our topic for today. The sharira traya, the three shariras, include the sthula sharira, sukshma sharira, and the third is karana sharira, which we have to understand properly. First of all, sharira literally means body, but don't take it too literally. Obviously, with regard to your sthula sharira, it is physically a body, but sukshma sharira, your sukshma sharira is non-physical. It has no form, no shape, no color. So you can't really, it's not literally a body. We call it subtle body, but it is not literally a body. So don't get stuck on sharira meaning body. And that's even more true for karana sharira. So it's body in a figurative sense. It is, however, cause. Karana sharira, causal body. Cause for what? The karana sharira is a cause for the other two bodies, the sthula sharira and the sukshma sharira. Let's understand why. There's a causal chain we have to understand. You were born. What is the cause for your birth? This is the beginning of the causal chain. You were born. Being born has a cause. What is that cause? You know the answer to this question, even though it may not be on the tip of your tongue. You're born because of your past karmas. Because of your accumulated past karmas, you get reincarnated. All those karmas have to be fructified, as they say. So therefore, the laws of karma drive your sukshma sharira onwards to take another physical body to exhaust those karmas. So you are born. The cause for your birth is karma. Now, what's the cause for karma? This is a causal chain. The cause for karma, why do you do what you do? Right now you're watching me. Why are you watching me? And the simple answer is you want to. There's a desire. Actions are driven by desire. Karma, actions, are driven by kama, desire. Here's our causal chain. Birth is caused by karma. Karma is caused by desire, kama. And then the next step in the causal chain is why do you have kama? Why do you have so many desires that you want to fulfill? Why aren't you just content and you don't need to do anything? Well, here it's pure Vedanta. because you don't recognize your true nature as being innately full and complete. Ananda, consciousness. Because your true self is unrecognized. Therefore, you find yourself incomplete, lacking things, and therefore you have desire to fulfill whatever you need. You have desires to get what you need. You have desires to get away from what you don't want. All of this is driven by, to use my guru's language, self-non-recognition. Desire is a result of self-non-recognition. So look at our causal chain. Birth is a result of karma. Karma is a result of desire, kama. And kama, desire, is because you're not enlightened. And not enlightened is because of self-non-recognition, which is a word for ignorance. Ignorance is at the beginning of that causal chain. Birth is a result of karma. Karma is a result of kama. Kama is a result of ignorance. Not any kind of ignorance, but ignorance of your true self. Self-non-recognition. That means that the beginning of that causal chain is ignorance, self-non-recognition. And that is the karana sharira. The karana sharira is ignorance, in particular, self-non-recognition. That is karana sharira. There is no karana sharira other than that ignorance, and Śaṅkara makes that very plain in this next verse. Repeat after me, please. Anadya vidya nirvachya, anadya vidya nirvachya, karanopadhyuruchyate, karanopadhyuruchyate, upaditritayadanyam, upaditritayadanyam, atmanam avadharayeta, atmanam avadharayeta. Good. Start in the second line. Karana upadhihi uchyate. I'm breaking the words apart. Karana upadhi. He doesn't use the word sharira. Karana sharira, karana upadhi mean the same thing. Sharira is kind of a more basic term, body. Upadhi is a highly nuanced term. Upadhi, translated as conditioning adjunct. Not terribly helpful. We could say, just to remember the word upadhi, we say that this pot is an upadhi for clay. Upadhi causes clay to appear as a pot. That's why philosophers will call it conditioning adjunct. That's Śaṅkara's deliberate use of this very technical term, which is, this is Śaṅkara, a great scholar that he is. But in our current context, it simply means karana upadhi simply means karana sharira. Śaṅkara is just using this technical term. So karana sharira uchyate, karana upadhi. It is called the karana upadhi uchyate. It is called the karana upadhi or karana sharira. What is called the karana sharira? In the first line, anadi avidya. Avidya, ignorance, as we just said in that causal chain. Birth is caused by karma. Karma is caused by kama, desire. Desire is caused by avidya, ignorance, self-non-recognition. The karana sharira uchyate, it is called, what is called karana sharira is avidya, ignorance. What kind of ignorance? Anadi avidya, beginningless ignorance. With this first half of the verse, Śaṅkara finishes this topic of the three shariras, sharira traya. And the whole point of Sharira Traya, as we said in the introduction, is to establish the locus of the problem. And now in the second half, he moves on to describe what we're actually trying to accomplish. Why are we analyzing the three bodies? For this purpose. He says, Upadi Tritayat Anyam Atmanam. Atmanam, the true self, is anyam, different. Different from what? Upadi Tritayat. Different from the three upadis. Again, Śaṅkara is using that technical term, upadi, for the more common term, sharira. So upadi tritaya means sharira traya, the three bodies. Atmanam, your true self, Satchidananda Atma, consciousness, is anyam, other than upadi tritiyat, other than the three bodies. Avadharayet, Śaṅkara says, you have to discern the difference. You have to discern how your true self is different from your stula sharira, your sukshma sharira, and the karana sharira. This discernment is crucial. In Sanskrit, we use the word viveka. Viveka means discernment. This discernment is crucial because, and we're going to see this in the next verse, it is the absence of discernment that leads to suffering. The confusion between your true self, consciousness, and your body, mind, sense complex. We often say this expression in English, meaning your stula sharira, sukshma sharira, karana sharira. I'll sometimes use that word, body, mind, sense complex. I think it was my Paramaguru, Swami Chinmayananda, who started using that particular English expression. If we fail to discern the difference between our true nature as consciousness and the body, mind, sense complex, this is where suffering begins. And actually, let's move on to the next verse, because the next verse is going to describe how that suffering takes place due to the lack of discernment. Here in this verse, Śaṅkara says, avadharayet. You better discern the difference. And in the next verse, he's going to point out, if you fail to discern the difference, you're in for all kinds of problems. Let's see what those problems are. Repeat after me. Panchakoshadi yogena, panchakoshadi yogena, tattanmaya hivastitaha, tattanmaya hivastitaha, shuddhatma nilavastradi, shuddhatma nilavastradi, yogena spatiko yatha, yogena spatiko yatha. Panchakoshadi yogena. Panchakosha. 5 koshas. We just got done talking about 3 shariras. Now we're talking about panchakosha, 5 sheaths. And what Śaṅkara in the prior 3 verses described as 3 shariras, he's referring to the same topic, 3 shariras, with a different expression, panchakosha, 5 sheaths. These are equivalent expressions. We need to understand how. Kosha means covering. And kosha is equivalent in some sense to our word sharira in the prior 3 verses. And here there's an equivalence between these 5 koshas and the 3 shariras. It's not very hard to understand. We talked about the stula sharira, physical body. Well, the outermost of the 5 koshas is the Annamaya kosha. Annamaya, made of food. The sheath, which is Annamaya, made of food. Obviously, your physical body is made of all the food you've ever eaten. So the equivalence is this. The Stula Sharira is equivalent to the outermost of the 5 koshas, the Annamaya kosha. Then, within the Annamaya kosha are 3 more koshas, which constitute the Sukshma Sharira. You can see the equivalence. Outermost kosha, Annamaya kosha, is equivalent to the Stula Sharira. Within the Annamaya kosha are 3 more koshas, equivalent to the Sukshma Sharira. What are those 3 koshas? First is the Pranamaya kosha, the kosha made of prana. So within the Annamaya kosha is the Pranamaya kosha, part of Sukshma Sharira. Within the Pranamaya kosha is the Manomaya kosha, the kosha made of mind. Mind would include sense organs and other faculties, being part of the Sukshma Sharira. And within the Manomaya kosha is the Vijnanamaya kosha, Vijnana meaning buddhi. Remember we said manas and buddhi were part of the Sukshma Sharira. So here's the equivalent. Outermost kosha, Annamaya kosha, is equivalent to the Stula Sharira. Within the Annamaya are 3 more koshas, Pranamaya, Manomaya, and Vijnanamaya. These 3 koshas are equivalent to the Sukshma Sharira. Just different language, different ways of explaining. I'll give you the significance shortly. One more kosha. The innermost kosha is called Anandamaya kosha, and that innermost kosha, Anandamaya kosha, is equivalent to the Karana Sharira. Leading to the good question, how can Ananda be equivalent to the Karana Sharira, which is ignorance? What is the relationship between ignorance and bliss? You get it already. Ignorance is bliss. We use that expression in English quite a bit. Ignorance is bliss. But in a very real sense, in deep sleep, you are immersed in pure darkness, pure tamas, pure ignorance. Deep sleep is a state of being immersed in pure ignorance. And how do you experience that? It's blissful. We all love deep sleep. So you can see the equivalence between the Karana Sharira, which is ignorance, and the innermost kosha, which is the Anandamaya kosha. So we have this equivalence between the 3 shariras in the prior 3 verses, and in this verse, the Pancha kosha, the five koshas. Now the significance of these 5 koshas is there are 5, in the introduction I described the locus of the problem. These 5 koshas are sorry, I'm pausing. Locus, the plural of locus is loci. I think it's a Latin word, and I think the plural locus is 1. Loci is plural. So there are 5 loci, 5 locuses, if I can use that expression, 5 locuses for the problem of suffering. And that's what he says in the next line. He says, Tattan mayaha eva stitaha, and you can bring up the next word, Shuddhatma, Atma. The true self is stitaha. It is established in the presence of these 3 shariras. Atma, consciousness, is in the presence of these 3 shariras, or in the presence of the 5 koshas. And here's where the problem comes. He says, Tattan mayaha iva stitaha. Atma, in the presence, in the prior line, in the first line, Pancha koshadi yogena. Yogena, due to the association of Atma with the 5 koshas, there are 5 loci for the problem of suffering. That's the proper understanding of Panchakosha. 5 places where suffering takes place. And how does that suffering take place? He says, tat tat mayaha. I'm breaking the word apart. Tat tat mayaha eva. Atma eva, as though tat tat mayaha becomes identical to each of the 5 koshas. And to use simpler language, Atma becomes identified with each of the 5 koshas. Atma gets identified with the Annamaya kosha, your physical body, with the Pranamaya kosha, etc. And it's this identification, tat tan mayaha, loosely speaking, identification. Superimposition. Superimposition is the topic of this section of the text. And this superimposition or identification is the root of suffering. First of all, let's understand what this identification is about. Take the first kosha, Annamaya kosha. Atma is identified with the Annamaya kosha, and in a very clear way. Your Annamaya kosha is either male or female. Consciousness is neither male or female. But due to identification, you say, I am male or female. The true sense of I, the essential being that you are, the true I is consciousness, which is neither male nor female, but you say, I am male or female, meaning you take the attributes of your Annamaya kosha, the outermost kosha, and you superimpose the maleness or femaleness of your body, you superimpose it on Atma. Now, in this case, doesn't necessarily cause suffering, but suppose your body is ill. Suppose you recognize that your body is decaying. We're all decaying. Our bodies are all... The word sharira, after all we said, means that which decays. We are all breaking down and decaying. Every day we're one day older. When you are identified with your physical body, which is constantly aging, constantly decaying, subject to more and more problems, and finally subject to illness and death, when you identify with your physical body, the problems of your body become the problems of Atma. Atma, of course, has no problems. Atma is Satchidananda, Atma is Satchidananda, full, complete, limitless, vast consciousness, utterly unaffected by anything and everything in the world. Here comes the problem of identification. Tat tat mayaha. When you identify yourself at any of the 5 koshas, and we're going in our next class, we'll go through this in detail. We'll go through identification with each one of these 5 koshas. It is this identification which is at the root of suffering. In fact, we started we're 45 minutes into our class. Oh, we have time. We can do this in this class. Let me demonstrate how identification with each one of the 5 koshas is the cause for suffering. Your Annamaya kosha, the outermost kosha, is a locus of the problem of identification. As I said before, when you identify with your physical body, the problems of your body become your problems. If old age and illness belong to my body and not to me as Satchidananda Atma, as consciousness, my relationship is so different. I can be more objective. I won't feel threatened. If I know that the problem belongs to the body and not to me, it won't be so threatening. If the problem of old age and death belongs to me, my gosh, that's really scary. But if I know the problem belongs to my body and the body is separate from me, I can be more objective and deal with it properly. So if the body has a problem, I take the body to the doctor and I ask the doctor, what do I do for this problem? It's less threatening in the absence of identification. In the presence of identification, the problems of the body become my problems, the problems of your body become your problems, and you suffer tremendously. So the Annamaya Kosha is the first of 5 loci, I think that's the pronunciation, 5 locuses of identification. Within that Annamaya Kosha is the Pranamaya Kosha. Prana is life force, but we get identified with that life force. In fact, almost every day, you and I will say, oh, I'm so tired. I'm tired. Wait a minute. Atma doesn't get tired. Tiredness belongs to the Pranamaya Kosha. But look at the difference. When you're identified with Pranamaya Kosha, you say, I'm exhausted. You know how that feels. But suppose you weren't so identified with the Pranamaya Kosha. Suppose you're able to say, oh, my body is tired today. Look at the difference of those two perspectives. One, I am exhausted, complete identification. The other is, my body is tired. Note there's some objectivity there. Wherever there's that objectivity, the problems are not so threatening, not so overwhelming. We can handle those problems better. So when you're identified with your physical body, the problems of the body are your problems, are very threatening. When you're identified with the Pranamaya Kosha, the problems of the Pranamaya Kosha become your problems and become very threatening. Then within the Pranamaya Kosha is the Manomaya Kosha. Manas, mind. Mind would include, how about agitation and fear? Emotions belong to your Manomaya Kosha. Emotions like fear belong to your Manomaya Kosha. When you say, I am afraid, my gosh, how much suffering is associated when you identify yourself with your Manomaya Kosha. Fear is a fact, but fear is an emotional reality that belongs to your mind. We've gone through this several times already. You are the conscious being, separate from your physical body, and separate from your senses, and separate from your mind. You are the conscious observer of whatever's happening in your mind, and as the conscious observer, you are separate from whatever is happening in your mind. The metaphor we gave before. The sun shines, but the sun shines on the earth, but the sun is not affected by what it shines on. If the sun shines on a temple, the sun doesn't become more sacred. If the sun shines on a puddle of filth, the sun doesn't become defiled. The sun is utterly unaffected by what it shines upon. In the same way, your consciousness is utterly unaffected by the conditions of your mind that it illumines. So, when fear is present in your mind, that fear is illumined by the consciousness, which is your true nature. Excuse me. The consciousness, which is your true nature, is utterly unaffected by that fear. By the way, the second half of the verse, which we'll see in our next class, we'll see how your consciousness is unaffected. We'll see in the next class. But right now, the problem of identification. When you fail to discern the difference between your true self, Atma, and these 5 koshas, that's where suffering takes place. If you fail to discern the difference between Atma and Annamaya kosha, the problems of your body become your problems, very threatening. When you fail to discern the difference between your true self, Atma, and Pranamaya kosha, the problems of your Pranamaya kosha become your problems. Then you complain, oh, I'm exhausted, I'm so tired. This is more suffering. And now the Manomaya kosha. When you fail to discern that your true nature as consciousness is utterly separate from the attributes of your mind, including fear, that failure to discern the difference leads to suffering. When you fail to discern the difference, you identify yourself wrongly with that mind and the fear that afflicts the mind, and then you say, I am afraid. And in that experience of fear, there's so much suffering. I am afraid. Suppose you could discern the difference between your true self, consciousness, and fear, which is an emotion whose locus is your mind, Manomaya kosha, and the presence of fear in your mind is known to you, the conscious observer, the conscious observer who is separate and distinct from that fear. When you can say, fear is present in my mind, notice the identification is gone. If you say, I am afraid, there's no discernment whatsoever. There's only identification and superimposition and suffering. When you can discern, fear is present in my mind, fear is observed by me, the conscious being, and the fear present in my mind doesn't affect the consciousness, which is my true nature, at all. With this discernment, suffering comes to an end. Fear doesn't come to an end necessarily. Suffering comes to an end. The key is discernment. This verse is talking about the consequences of the absence of discernment. So, if you fail to discern the difference between Atma and your Annamaya kosha, you suffer. When you fail to discern the difference between your true self, Atma, and Pranamaya kosha, life force, you suffer. When you fail to discern the difference between Atma, your true self, and Manomaya kosha, mind, you suffer. Within that Manomaya kosha is a Vijnanamaya kosha, intellect. Intellect would include our decision-making process. In making decisions, we're often confused. Confusion belongs to the Vijnanamaya kosha. If you say, I am confused, you are identifying yourself with your Vijnanamaya kosha. By the way, Vijnanamaya kosha is a fancy term for buddhi, intellect. That's all it means. Manomaya kosha means mind, includes senses, etc. Vijnanamaya kosha simply means buddhi, intellect. When you identify yourself with your buddhi, with your intellect, the problems of your intellect become your problems. The confusion of your intellect becomes your confusion, and then you complain, oh, I'm so confused. More suffering. Suffering due to identification. Identification due to the absence of discernment. Suppose you could discern. Suppose you could separate yourself from all 5 koshas. Suppose you understand clearly confusion belongs to your intellect, vijnanamaya kosha. That confusion is known to you, the awareful witness, the conscious observer. You are the consciousness, the conscious being who knows the presence of confusion in your mind. And further, if you can understand that the presence of confusion in your mind doesn't affect you, consciousness, what tremendous freedom you will have with that discernment. This is our topic of the 5 koshas, where there is the absence of discernment with regard to any of the 5 koshas, then there is the opportunity for suffering. Where there is discernment, there's the end of suffering. And there's one exception to that, for example. I suppose it's an exception with regard to the Anandamaya kosha. In deep sleep, you experience this ananda. You wake up and you said, I was blissful in deep sleep. Fortunately, there's no suffering. That is the one kind of identification which doesn't cause suffering. That's why we say in English, ignorance is bliss. When you identify with that Anandamaya kosha, which is, you remember, equivalent to the Kadana Sharira, ignorance, that particular identification doesn't cause suffering. But when you identify with the other 5 koshas, it absolutely causes suffering. So, to wrap up this topic, in the prior 3 verses, Śaṅkara described the 3 shariras, the locus of the problem. In this verse, he goes into more detail and describes that the 3 shariras can be understood in terms of 5 koshas. Each of these 5 koshas is the locus of a mistake, the locus of identification that leads to suffering. When you, just in simple language, when you identify with your physical body, you suffer. When you identify with the prana, the pranamaya kosha, you suffer. When you identify with your mind and intellect, you suffer. But when these teachings of Vedanta help you to discern the difference between the conscious being, which is your essential nature, when you can discern the difference between you and your body, difference between you and your prana, difference between you and your mind and intellect, this discernment is the key to becoming free from suffering. In the absence of discernment, there is identification. Due to identification, there's suffering. In the presence of discernment, there's wisdom. And with that wisdom comes the absence, freedom from suffering. That's why this whole text, Ātma-bodha, discernment of your true nature as Atma, as pure consciousness. This discernment leads to bodha, wisdom, and that wisdom leads to freedom from suffering. There's much more in the second half of this verse, which we'll see in the next class. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinah Sarve santu niramayaha, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschid dukkha bhag bhaveta, asato ma sadgamaya, tamaso ma jyotirgamaya, mrityor ma amritangamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Tat Sat.